Hey, I'm Alan Firstenberg.
And I'm Noble Ackerson.
And we are Two Voice Devs.
Two Voice Devs.
Wow, Noble, it has been a blizzard, a wild couple of days at Google I/O. You and I had an amazing time, I know that.
My head's still spinning.
My head, totally. There was so much talked about, but I don't know about you, but after the keynote, like every other person I saw came up to me and said, "So Alan, what do you think about the glasses?" Do you get the same reaction?
I believe so. I got DMs and text messages, and yeah, everyone wants to know from those of us who used to be glass explorers what we thought about the new Project Astra Gemini glass thingamabobbers.
Android XR, the whole
Yes.
mesh of stuff together. So I think we're going to spend the rest of this episode talking about what we thought about those glasses.
All right, let's do it.
So I guess, I feel like a bit of background. You and I have known each other now for just over 12 years. We met each other at the Glass Foundry Hackathon event in New York.
That's right.
Where we put glass on for the first time. We tried it out. We experienced what it was like, and then we experienced what it was like to develop for it and try to develop something new.
Yep. And
we just happened to sit next to each other, and we spent the entire time just kind of like brainstorming, what would we do? How would we do this? So I guess let's start with, what was glass like for you the first time you put it on?
Mind-blowing.
Yeah.
Completely just off the charts. I was giddy with excitement, fortunate that Google decided to invite me.
Out of one of 200 people.
Exactly.
Right.
To come try this thing so early. It gave me so much, I call it just, the awe and awesome. And I was just completely, the creative technologist in me just came alive. And you and I, like you're saying, could not stop riffing off of ideas of the art of the possible with this device.
Oh, that's a great way. What this meant, how this changed things.
Yeah.
How, as Timothy Jordan was, drilling into us that day, how glass, was there when you needed it and out of the way when you didn't, how it was, and they weren't using these terms then, it was this ambient, ubiquitous device that was there with you. And just, for me, it was that same sense of awe. It was that same sense of, this is different. Yeah. This is different than anything we've done before. And for me, that launched me into, what does this experience feel like? How will people use this going forward? Yeah. And a number of years later, when Glass had been retired, and again at another I/O, they announced Google Assistant. Mm-hmm. I saw that and I'm like, that's the next generation.
That's the replacement.
That was finally the replacement I had been looking for.
How'd that work out for you?
Yeah, about as well as glass worked out for me, I think. In fact, I had somebody who came to me and said, "So what did you think of this morning's announcement?" And I was talking and was gushing about Assistant and how it was ubiquitous and ambient and was doing all of these needs, and it was finally the successor to Glass. And they kind of gave me this look like, I was talking about the augmented reality announcements this morning.
The VR device.
The VR device. And I'm like, nah, I think that's a dead end.
Yeah. And we've debated this over time.
Many times.
Conversational AI versus spatial computing.
So now we're kind of seeing both of them colliding together.
That's right.
With this device.
Yeah, that's right.
So I guess the next question is, what was your first take? One of the great parts about I/O this year was we got to try it on.
Right.
We got to try these devices on at least a little. After seeing the demo of it during the keynote, although you skipped out on the keynote, I guess.
I did.
So what was your first reaction when you put this pair of glasses on?
Well, I skipped out on the keynote because someone I knew decided to text me and ask if I could help demo prep for the Android XI device. Of course, before she finished her sentence, I was at the door. And I did try it on. The difference between 2012, when I tried glass for the first time with you in New York, and now was, the battle scars of the art of the possible, and what I learned through the whole Glass Explorer program essentially shaped who I am as a technologist.
I think it shaped both of us, yeah.
Exactly.
How do you feel it shaped you?
I feel that human factors became the first problem that I tend to solve. Steve Jobs famously coined, start with a problem and you'll work your way back to the solution. I've bastardized that over the years, and with a lot of these emergent technologies, I tend to say, don't learn from the school of Kevin Costner. And what I mean by that is, if you build it, they will come makes for a terrible product strategy. Rather, if they come, if you know that you have something to bring, a need and address a real problem, then you
Yes.
can build it and build it right.
Yes, absolutely, yes. It's this notion of, address the problems.
Right.
Find the solutions to those problems. Technology for technology's sake,
Yeah.
I don't care. That's always been.
It gets you so far, right? It gets you to the point of novelty, and you will get rabid. What's the crossing the chasm nomenclature? They always say, the early adopters, right, are always going to sort of clamor on the novelty.
Yes.
But for that to be sustained, you need either a solution that is 10x or whatever the multiple is, an order of magnitude better than what is there, or in the case of these glasses, something that addresses a painkiller, or at least I'll call it a vitamin, enough to, allow you to cross that chasm between, all right, this is more than just a fancy toy and a conversational starter, to something that actually addresses real needs every day and augments my life, augments my device, other devices around me, whether be it my phone or other devices
The way I usually like to phrase it when I'm talking to somebody is, if you're introducing a new technology, you're introducing a solution, or you're introducing whatever, it needs to make my life better, or it needs to do something faster, it needs to do it cheaper, or ideally it needs to do all of those.
Right, and it's a tough proposition.
And it is tough. And if you're not doing that, you need to stop and say, well, why am I doing this?
Right.
Because technology is cool. There are technologies out there that are really cool. I love, you and I have this debate about VR all the time. I think VR is cool. I think AR is cool. But I don't see how it makes lives better, faster, cheaper.
So before we dive really,
and we're not going to go into that debate today.
Into the, you're right. We shouldn't. But before we dive into, I almost called it Project Glass. Before we dive into Android XR for a second, I remember, I can't remember, maybe 14 or so months ago, walking into an Apple store and trying the Vision Pro. And I left with a wow moment. Like, we disagree on this, but I found this thing really polished as a demo.
I probably wouldn't disagree with that.
It was super. It was a canned demo, and I was asked by the person sort of orchestrating the demo, and she goes, "Are you going to buy this thing?" And I go, "For what? It's a great demo, but I don't need a screen on a device." I think what I left her with was, this is being pitched, as great as the experience was, it's being pitched as a movie watching device, but the device is too heavy for my head. How long is a movie?
That's a good one. Okay, so, but it starts raising the questions about, as we're going into Android XR,
Right.
which its first iteration looks like it's made for those goggles. It's made for Project Moohan.
Right.
But they keep saying, the next generation of it, the next iteration is for smart glasses. Based on, okay, I hope the camera caught that facial expression there. Based on what you have seen so far, and admittedly, we played with the prototype. We're in early days, but based on what you've seen so far, how are you seeing Android XR for these glasses?
I think the vision of Android XR is brilliant. I think Google has proved that when you build an operating system focused on a specific modality or medium, and you make it modular enough to fit on multiple types of devices, it works. And this is on the phone. if they're using the same approach with the headsets, with partnerships with other eyewear companies, it's a great idea. My problem is that, something that you just said, if the notion is that we start with VR and go with AR, they've already lost in my opinion, they've already lost the thread. Why? Because spatial computing as a category, or XR as a category, always lives on a spectrum. There are use cases where I may want to be fully immersed, or somewhat immersed, and just spatially anchor a digital artifact on top of the real world in a way that doesn't drift or doesn't distract from what I need to do, right? It needs to provide me that context in an intelligent way, consistently, reliably, in a performant way, and just be out of the way when I no longer need it, right? So there are use cases for that. I think if they focus on the Moohan, which is a terrible name, but if they focus on the VR aspect of it, and I think that's a distraction. I think they should just focus on making experiences that matter, that solve real problems.
Well, I feel like what happened is that they started Android XR as the rumors of Apple's Vision Pro came out, and they're like, well, we're going to need to compete against that. And then when Apple Vision Pro kind of went nowhere, they're like, oh, Meta's doing something with glasses. Maybe we should look at that.
That's such short-sightedness. Google pioneered this space. They actually poured gasoline back in 2012 into this spatial computing and wearable computing, head-worn wearable computing world. They were decades ahead of anything we had ever experienced before. And so the notion that Google becomes sort of a Me Too player, as much as I am a GDE and I respect what Google does, I believe Google has so much to offer to set itself apart.
Here's the thing, though. Google has always been a Me Too player.
Right.
Google Search was a Me Too product.
Fair.
Okay? Google Gmail was a Me Too product.
Sure.
YouTube was a purchased Me Too product. Everything Google has done, Android was a purchased Me Too product.
MapQuest, Google Maps,
and everything they've done has always been somebody else pioneered this, and now we're going to come along and, at least in their minds, do it better.
Except for Glass, though, right?
Except for Glass, but how did that work out for them?
Well, they definitely inspired Vuzix, Epson, Microsoft with the HoloLens. They inspired
North.
Which is a very great segue, right?
Which they then bought.
They bought North, this little Canadian company that then turned into, I'm sure, multiple iterations of what we're seeing
today.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit more about what we're seeing today.
Right.
See what we did.
I like that.
So the experience that we tried on, and so the experience that they also shared with us, I thought was interesting, was kind of ends up being this three-legged stool of three kind of slightly different products almost, because we have the hardware, and with it we've got the frame manufacturers. So we've got Warby Parker and a couple of others. We have the hardware by Samsung initially.
Right.
We have Android XR, which is the operating system and the app system. I don't know what else to call it really. It's the app.
We'll learn more.
Right. and then we have Gemini, which seems like it's going to be the primary user interface for, at least for the glasses part.
Right.
And that's three different departments in Google.
Right.
And that's kind of interesting to me. And right now we've got a really good feel for the Gemini part, because the Gemini part is very similar to Gemini Live, which we can play with on our phones today.
Right.
The Android XR part, we don't have a good understanding of yet. The hardware, we've just started getting a really good feel for it. And we played with a prototype, and we know it's a prototype.
Right.
How do you feel like those three pieces are playing together? Are they going to play well together?
Right. So on the hardware side, that's easy. The hardware has to be light, which it was, in my opinion. That's a plus.
That's interesting. I heard mixed feelings about it, but I didn't feel it was terribly bulky.
Yeah, no, I threw that in the plus corner. The hardware was comfortable. It felt well balanced as far as the weight distribution,
Yes.
which is something that Google does very well with Daydream and of course with
right,
Google Glass.
with Google
yeah.
Glass, they put a lot of effort into making sure that balance was good.
Yep. And so for me, I had no problem with the outer shell. As far as the optics, I have some complaints, but I would say the version of the demo that we all tried had basically a screen, for lack of a better way to put it, within your field of view, and it was lower than, say, Glass, that is
Which
more
is in the upper right.
sat
And that
on
was
the top.
that was an interesting design decision.
Right.
And I'm kind of curious about why they chose that lower field of view.
Right.
I'm concerned that once you get too much text, it might interfere with the field of view.
Mm-hmm.
But my initial reaction was, this is different than Glass. I feel like this might be a design mistake, but you know what? It's been 10 years of user research.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe they know something new.
I think they do. I think since the days of Glass, there was a lot of research from human-computer interaction researchers focused on spatial computing. From all of the research that I read, they all anchored on ambient interfaces, especially with augmented reality, to not occlude your field of view even when presenting information.
Right, absolutely.
And
Important.
so even your primary actions, or let's say a menu, or information that they expect you to not be walking around to do, those would be sort of set lower than your sight line so that you are intentionally looking down, sometimes with a warning. If you want an example of that, if you pull out your phone and you have the latest version of Google Maps, at least for the last 6 years, or if not longer, and you pull up the Maps feature, you go into AR mode for your turn-by-turn direction feature. You'll notice that when you lower the phone, it gives you an interactive map. If you lift up your phone, the augmented reality interactions go away.
Oh,
it
interesting.
it actually gives you a safety message saying, as we detected you're moving, and as we detected your the phone's up or whatever it says, we're turning off this interactive feature. That it's not as verbose as I'm making it.
Because that's a usability feature.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so it's a usability thing. It's a standard practice. You'll notice it in a lot of, Meta with a Quest device also has the primary actions below the sight line.
And
so it's a practice that is established, yeah.
As somebody else pointed out to me, if you're using bifocals or trifocals, the reading part
Yep.
is in the lower part of your glasses.
Exactly.
And I'm like, well, okay, that's now following standard visual, visual design. So it was interesting. That was one of the differences
as they
between the
should,
two.
right? Even with the Gemini part, if they are building off of work, your past work with conversational design and conversational AI, a lot of the natural language best practices, and when you're receiving inputs from a machine and when you're giving your intent to the machine, needs to follow some sort of natural, well-established science, I guess.
Yeah.
So to say.
Well,
Yeah.
and I guess I feel like one of the things that I hope comes out of this, as we approach the point where we're developing our own apps for this, and we'll get to more of that in a second, I hope, that they start sharing with us, here are the design decisions that went into this. Here's why. Here's how you need to follow those design decisions as well. Because we had that with Glass.
Absolutely.
We had, here's why it's in the upper right-hand corner. Here's the font sizes that you need. Here's why you need those fonts. Here's why you shouldn't crowd this out.
Right.
Here's a design template that works really well for notifications and stuff.
Right. And that's just the hardware. Remember,
Right.
you had 3 tent poles.
Yeah.
What was the next?
So the next tentpole was
on Android XR, right?
well, it was Android XR or Gemini. Which one do you want to take next?
Let's take Android XR. You
Okay.
said something earlier that I kind of disagree with. You mentioned Gemini as the user interface. It's not. It's
Oh, really?
Yeah. Android XR is the user interface. At least the operating system delivering an interface to enable the intelligence layer, which is basically an application. If you look at it as a stack, you've got the
Okay. No,
hardware,
that's fair.
you've got the hardware, you've got the OS, and you've got the intelligence layer. And the intelligence layer the operating system or the user interface is orchestrating, or at least managing, how we use the battery and the hardware artifacts, as well as contextual information to enable context for the AI.
So here's where maybe we will disagree.
Mm-hmm.
I see, and you're right. It's the Android operating system that does need to do all of this part.
Right.
I feel like it's the XR
Right.
layer of that
Mm-hmm.
that is not, that is going to be the primary application
Mm-hmm.
interface. But kind of the way they pitched it and the way they demonstrated it is the primary user interface
Yeah.
is Gemini. And this is where...
That's because you're only seeing part of the demo.
This is where I think there's some conflict in what they're doing and how they're doing it, and I've got too many questions here.
So you've got the Android stuff, we know Android.
Right.
You've got the XR part. I love that you bifurcated that. So the XR part, what it's doing is it's telling the hardware, well, it's getting from the hardware what it's seeing, right? And it's basically, determining depth of field. It's giving you light sensor information. It's giving you information to stream to your Gemini, your AI.
Okay, this is fair.
What is important, because the thing that the one advantage that you have with Gemini Live on a phone versus Gemini Live on the headset is now you have a medium to consume information, multimodal information that does not require that can also take in gestures while you're doing it live. So if I'm able to, able to point to something where you weren't,
that's fair.
we weren't able to do
when
that.
you say gestures, though, what starts worrying me, and this is something that we see in the goggles, is I don't want, I'm okay with what I would call a natural gesture. Right. What is that?
Yes.
Okay. What I don't want is for them to turn that into
I'm
making
not
gestures to swipe pages.
I'm sure I
am not sure of that.
I hope for sure that whole Iron Man Tony Stark interface does not work.
No.
Yeah, we know that.
But okay, so you made a valid point, and generally I would agree. Gemini Live itself is on top of Android XR.
Right.
What I feel like the question for me is, what's going to be the primary human interaction touch point, I guess is the way to put it. And what the demonstrations all make it sound like is that's Gemini.
It's actually not so different from the Glass OS that we used to play with.
Right.
If you think about it, it's the human interaction point is gestures. It's the taps on the device, which for those who will eventually experience Android XR, the device itself had tap to tell Gemini to not listen anymore, which is a great privacy feature. And so that's one human input. And then, of course, you had voice, which is another human input. Of course, in order to talk to Gemini, you have audio, which is another output, I guess.
Yeah.
And then Gemini is taking those as audio to text or audio to audio. Gemini is obviously natively multimodal in order to do something with it to bring value back to you.
Right.
So
and I guess this I feel like part of the reason why we're having this terminology discussion, this struggle here, is they really haven't made it clear.
They have not.
The demonstrations we've seen are all interacting with Gemini, and occasionally Gemini will show you a map, or Gemini will send a text message.
Right.
And then if you talk to the Android people, they're talking about how you can build an Android XR app and include in it Gemini Live. Because that's what you can do with Android apps, and you'll. But we don't have a sense of how do you get from one to the other. We don't have this.
Do we have an API for Gemini Live?
No.
Okay, good. So
no, we don't.
That's my point.
Right.
I'm thinking, if I were to put on a product strategy hat for a second, that the devices that we tried today are not live. They're not available for general.
They're
consumption.
prototypes.
They're prototypes, and so I would, if I were the boss at Android XR or Gemini or whichever department is doing what, I would say enable developers, give the right types of documentation and supportability to developers to start developing on Gemini Live, for Gemini Live, whatever the use cases is. Perhaps provide some canned use cases in the same way 12 years ago we had that opportunity.
So two things.
Without the glasses, by the way.
Right, yeah. And
On
I
your
think that's
phone.
one of the interesting things about this is that we can at least start doing some of that with Gemini Live if we had an API. And this is the point where we're going to say if any Googler is watching this, we will be fantastic test users for all of this. So you know how to find us. We would love to help you design those APIs, build those APIs, try them out, try the documentation, call us. We're here to help you. And we're here to help you.
For free. I'm not buying prototype
We'll get to that.
glasses.
We'll get to that part in a minute. But no, and I think that's exactly it, is that I feel like, at least right now, yes, ideally, I would love that API for Gemini Live.
Yep.
And I'd love to know how that handoff happens. But they're not, as far as I can tell, they're not even talking about it. And this, I think, was a big difference between when Glass launched in 2012. It was still several months before we got a hint of what the API would be like.
Right.
A couple more months before we were able to...
we played it with an early version of the API, and we gave them feedback.
And then we got to the...
At least
at the Foundry event.
Yeah.
But it was several months between I/O and that Foundry event.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah.
Where all that they told us was there will be an API.
Right.
We do envision a way for you to do this handoff, but we don't have details finding it. We then played with an early version. We gave them that feedback. And then when it did launch several months later, our feedback had been incorporated.
Yep.
My concern is right now, I don't feel like they've turned to anybody to find out what do we as developers need to do that. What if we're building for Gemini, what does that interface need to do that handoff? If we're building for Android XR, how do we need to get triggered?
I would say, Alan, be patient.
Well, my point is, yes, of course we've got to be. I don't have a choice.
Yeah.
But
that's true.
But my point is that, they at least gave us assurances at the beginning of Glass, before we could play with it, that yes, be patient, it's coming.
That's right.
We haven't heard that.
All right, Google, you're listening. We can help you. Send a device. We'll help. I'll personally start writing the docs with the help of Gemini.
So, we don't want this. We could talk for hours on this. Right. Let's go with the quick. What was the best thing you found about the device?
Rapid fire.
And what was your biggest irk point? Maybe.
The best thing was the promise of an intelligent ambient thing that just sits there. And
you could feel Jarvis, you're saying.
I could feel Jarvis. It was responsive, being able to do the things that I'm familiar with Gemini on the phone, at least some of it. I'll get to that in a second. But on the flip side of that, I felt that, one, there were some inconsistencies with how it parsed human language, for people with accents, that was a problem. That did not happen to me. That was just feedback from our colleagues.
I've seen other people reporting it, yes.
My issue really stems from the fragmentation of Google's intelligence products.
Yes.
With Assistant, most famously, Assistant works differently in my Android Automotive or Android Auto. Well, it works differently from Android Automotive. It works differently when you go to Android Auto. It works differently from Android Wear. It works differently, so on and so forth. And so the issue is, what flavor of Gemini do we get on the glasses? Now, that is starkly different from tuning Gemini's use to the modality which I'm using.
You would expect some commands would only work on some devices.
Right.
And that's understandable. But the fact that even basic instructions seem to work differently
Right.
in Assistant. And we were worried about that in
I
Gemini.
if I have a smart light switch or a smart bulb and I look at that, will I natively be able to, if I have the
Yes.
development, if I've developed a smart home thing, which I'm thinking about doing, will I be able to just sort of turn it off? All right, so
I don't like the fact that you did that. See,
yes.
that's the gesture
So
I don't
just-
like.
No, I just want to just like
Yeah.
a Jedi.
Yeah. For me, the thing that I liked is that it felt like we were getting there. This does feel like the next evolution. It feels like we're heading there. The downside to me, and it took me a while to realize what this was that I had issues with, was that Glass's design was very, very nuanced about a lot of things. You needed to gesture to wake it up, but you could gesture to wake it up. Assistant, yes, it needed a hot word, but that was helpful because it meant it wasn't listening all the time.
Right.
For this device, it felt like I was going back to the phone.
Yeah.
I needed to touch it to turn it on.
Yeah.
And touch it to pause it. There was no hot
Yeah,
word.
yeah.
There was no dynamic. It felt like I was taking a step backwards on those things. And it felt to me like there were a bunch of little things like that.
I think it's early days. I think that from the time that they developed this interface to today, a lot has changed in generative AI world. Now everything is agentic, and I think the notion of an agent sort of changes our human-computer interaction.
I would say that, except for the fact that we've been talking about agents in the Alexa and Assistant space
Right.
for 10 years.
Yeah.
Okay, that's not really a new concept there.
Right.
So either they weren't paying attention to that, which is possible,
Right.
Or-
Start simple though.
or-
We got to start simple.
or they feel that they're onto something different.
Right.
But it's my concern that they're reinventing the wheel and not learning from
Yeah.
the pluses and minuses
Yeah,
of
you're
what we
right.
did before.
You're right.
And
I
that's
can't
kind
argue
of
with that.
so bottom line.
Bottom line.
Would you buy one today? If you got that phone call that said, Noble, we've got a prototype sitting for you here today, would you buy
My
it?
mind says no. My body says yes. My heart says yes. And this is why. It depends on the price.
Well, what's the price? What's the yes price point?
$499.
I assume that's $490.
$499.
Yes, I would agree with that price point.
Yeah. I think that is a nice balance that doesn't contribute to that growing, what I call a growing intelligence gap between folks that are expected to pay $250 for Gemini Ultra and folks that may not have the money to do that. And I think if you go down the same mistakes as a $1,600, smart computer on your face, like you're wearing right now, that's gonna alienate a lot of folks and cause some of the same problems as before.
Yeah, no, I would agree. 500 is the no-brainer point for me. Above that, I'd have to think.
You'd have to think,
and some of that would depend on knowing what's that transition going to be. What's the developer story going to be?
Right. And for me, it would be the human factors. What need or what main pain point? What is it doing that perhaps can 10x the value of my phone?
And you see, it's because for me, it was obvious to me from the moment I saw it, from the moment I put Glass on, it was obvious to me how it was going to change
Right.
what I was doing in the real world.
Right.
And I don't know that yet with this device.
Well, we'll see.
But we will see, and we will talk about this some more, I am quite sure, on Two Voice Devs.
Two voice steps.